This is very exciting. Hi, I'm Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. I've got a big challenge before me here today. I'm going to talk about a standard, and I need to make it interesting. So it won't be too long, but I think there's a lot to it. This is API 1164 from the American Petroleum Institute, the Pipeline Control Systems Cybersecurity Standard that was published version 3 in August 2021. Now, the first thing about it is the standard costs $200. I will tell you at the end of this show whether it's worth $200 or not, but I want to talk just a little bit about charging for standards because I guess I always have had a bit of an issue with it. I mean, first of all, I'd say, well, what is the organization trying to accomplish? And is charging for this standard helping them meet their mission? The second thing is, how much money are they really making off of this? How many people are paying $200 for this standard? And if it's a small number, is that revenue worth, I guess, the lesser impact of what you hope the standard would occur or would happen if more people could read it, if it was out there free of charge? So I'm always a little bit curious about why they charge for these things. IEC does the same sort of thing. You could say, well, they need to make money some way. Quite frankly, I think there's probably a better way to monetize it. And just to look at it from a personal standpoint, I have the show. I could charge for it. I could run YouTube ads on it. There's almost no money in that, so it's just annoyance and it's not furthering my mission. I could, and I have in the past had a podcast sponsor. I might have one in the future, but for this year, I just looked. I could make about $500 an episode, and it just wasn't worth the work of getting the sponsor, reading the ad, annoying my listeners and viewers. So I just decided not to do it. And I, quite frankly, monetize this by hopefully getting more people to ask for, potentially getting more keynote speeches, maybe getting more consulting. So I'm not against someone making money, but I'm just questioning whether charging $200 for the standard is the best way for API to make money. And it's certainly not the best way to achieve their mission if it's to, part of it is to make secure and reliable pipeline operations. But let's move on from the cost. First of all, it's great that this came out. It was well overdue. The previous version, which was basically just a refresh of the first version, very old, very incomplete, not a good document. So kudos to them for getting version 3 out there. Should have happened sooner, but that's great. If you're looking at this document, it is really tailored for the pipeline industry. It even says right there in quote, tailored for the oil and natural gas pipeline industry. So very specific standard for a very specific sector. Now, the timing of it isn't really that great because we've just had with Colonial Pipeline, and now with all the interest around that, TSA is issuing requirements for pipeline operators. So if I'm a pipeline operator, do I really care about what API says, or do I just need to do what my regulator says I should do? Now, it could be behind the scenes, these guidelines, these security controls that are going to be required are not public. So I have not seen them, but perhaps they're just pointing to 1164. When you get into 1164, though, I doubt it because they're not really technology specific. So my guess is it's not. So 1164 has a bit of an issue going into this. You put out version 3. Hopefully you get a big buzz of it. Hopefully Colonial Pipeline makes people interested in cybersecurity. But if I'm a pipeline operator, I might say, well, I have limited time and attention. I'm just going to focus on what the U.S. government is telling me what I should do. Now let's get into the document itself. It was very wise of them to leverage the NIST CSF cybersecurity framework. I mean, that really is the only way to go for a U.S. sector. Internationally, you could make an argument. I think the CSF is actually good for any sector. It's something that doesn't exactly tell you what you have to do, but it gives you a framework for you to present your security policy in. So I think that's great. And in fact, I would even point to IEC 62443, where they have a lot of mappings. I think that's less effective than actually coming out with protection profiles, as this document does. So I think the approach they took was dead on. They came up with 3 protection profiles, uh, going in order of rigor. 1 was baseline, 2 was enhanced, and 3 was extended. Now, how they defined who should use which profile was a little bit confusing. I don't think it's going to be confusing how it's actually used, but the way the document talked about it, they mixed impact and threat. And they said, well, if you're high threat, you should pick extended, the highest protection profile, or the most rigorous. So you had high, medium, low threat, high, medium, and low protection profile. But then they also said if you had high, medium, and low impact, you should pick high, medium, and low protection profile. In the end, I think most people will pick the appropriate protection profile based on the impact of an outage of the system that they're protecting on the business objectives, which again is defined in the document actually pretty well. They just throw in this threat thing that is really uncertain. For example, I don't know what you're supposed to do if you think there's a high threat and a low impact based on their charts. To me, the low impact would mean that you just take the basic or the baseline profile. But again, that's undetermined. We'll get more into some of the security controls around those profiles in a second. I think one of the areas that was mostly wasted words was Section 5, which was on the cybersecurity policy plan and program. There wasn't really anything wrong there. I can't say, oh, what they wrote was wrong. It just wasn't very helpful. It was very generic stuff. And I guess if you are that organization and you're only going to put out one document, maybe you need to put that out. So I wouldn't fault them for including it. It's just that if you buy it, I don't think it's going to really help you put together your cybersecurity policy plan or program. But then in there, they snuck something in that I would say really didn't fit that definition, cybersecurity policy plan and program. But in 5.4.1, they have security zones and conduits. And this is very similar to what you see in 62443, where you will essentially create security zones and conduits between those zones, and then you will determine which of the 3 protection profiles should apply to that zone. A few interesting comments about the way they did it. They have this concept of internal zones, external zones, and intermediate zones. Why I don't know why they didn't call those DMZs, I'm not sure. That's the language that everyone uses, but they decided to call it intermediate zone. But my reading of it was it is a DMZ. Another interesting thing was that everything in that zone falls under the same protection profile. So if you decide, for example, that compromise of a cyber asset in that zone would be high impact, that means you should use the most rigorous protection profile, the extended protection profile. And if you use that for that one asset, you use it for all assets within the zones. Now, this is not that unusual. We see this very commonly done. I'm not sure from a risk perspective it makes sense, especially from an efficient risk reduction standpoint. And the way a lot of people get around that is they create smaller zones. So they will essentially take, if there's a small number of assets in what would logically be a zone, then they'll create a subzone or 2 zones, one with the high impact, let's say the ones that would require the extended protection profile, and then another zone for the ones that would require the basic. So it adds a little bit of complexity, and that actually is a good thing. We don't see a lot of internal zoning in asset owners today, and that's probably an area where they could improve. Another interesting thing was they say that you're supposed to separate your wireless zones from your wired zones. So anytime you have wireless, that per this standard means it needs to be in its own zone. And then there would be a conduit to the wired zone. And I guess the last thing that I would say would be, let me just look at my notes here. Oh, that they talked about wide area networks, because again, you're talking pipelines here. So you have compressor stations and other stations along a pipeline. So you're almost always talking about a SCADA system with a wide area network with maybe some local DCS or smaller local control systems. What they're saying, if you use a wide area network, they don't differentiate between the required protections if that's a company run network or a network that you're buying services from, which I think I don't really have a problem with that. I haven't seen that too often. I often see organizations have greater trust in their own networks, but perhaps, let's say their own radio networks, but perhaps that's misplaced. Maybe we should have the same security controls required regardless of who is running the network. Now I'm going to get a little bit into the protection profiles themselves, so that we're not going to go through all the categories and subcategories and everything. I will tell you, though, that they lay out these protection profiles, but they're very clear that they can be customized. So this would mean if I am a pipeline owner operator, I could say I am following 1164 and I have done zones and conduits. I've looked at their protection profiles, but I have modified them. But that would still make me compliant with 1164 if there is such a thing, certainly compliant with the 1164 methodology. The only requirement is you do this based on risk and that you document it. So if you were going to undergo an audit, for example, you would want to have any variances from the 1164 protection profiles documented to say why we did this, and our decision was a risk-based decision. Now, this risk could be kept because it's viewed as a lower risk than the protection profile did, the 1164 protection profile, or it could be that you feel that mitigating that risk was going to be too expensive and you chose to accept it. So you can go on either side of the risk equation. You can accept more risk than 1164 envisions. That is allowed. Okay, now to the actual protection profile itself, which makes up a lot of the document, because essentially the way they do it for each category and subcategory in the NIST protection profile, they then will list all of the baseline requirements. And then if there are additional ones for for enhanced or extended, you'll include those. Now, this is, if you've read any of the NIST documents, this is similar to SP 853 or the ICS, I guess, add on to that, SP 800-82, where they'll list the baseline, and then with increasing rigor, you can go down the list. So it's very easy to read. I will say that one of the things that was really strange to me, though, was someone in the identify a principle or requirement, fundamental requirement, one of the big five, they mix the order of the categories. And in a couple of the, I think in identify and protection, they mixed the subcategories. So, for example, you could have protection AC-5 come before protection AC-1, which really confused me. I'm not sure why they did that. So, just if you're reading it, just be aware that just because you're seeing the number skip, that doesn't mean they didn't address it. They probably addressed it later on in the document, although I did not go through and check to see if every subcategory was addressed. It would have made sense for the document to have it in the same order. And actually, if they said a subcategory was not required, to list it as not required. Maybe something for version 3.1. Simple example of this, how this works, is right at the beginning in the identification governance. It requires you to have a policy. The basic baseline requires you to review and potentially update that policy every 36 months, whereas the enhanced and extended require you to update that policy every 12 months. A lot of these things are going to probably not use the baseline policy because, for example, if you have a policy, you're going to have a policy across the entire organization. If you've got a vulnerability management plan, you're going to have it across the entire organization, OT organization. I don't see that if you had, let's say, one zone that was only at the baseline level of risk, it was considered low impact if compromised. I can't see you saying we're going to have one policy for that and a different policy for enhanced. So for most of the controls that are required here in 1164, I think that you are probably going to, just to make the whole program work, you're going to default to whatever is the highest, which again isn't always that great. In fact, I don't think there will be much use of the basic baseline. I think everything will either be enhanced or extended, but we shall see. One other thing about the way it's laid out, there is, for a lot of the subcategories, there is supplemental guidance. And that was some of the more interesting reading in the document. For example, there were a number of supplemental guidance for IIoT and for other areas. So I would not ignore that, because actually I think some of the more useful information is there because they weren't required to actually follow a formula. This is something that they said, this is important. It doesn't fit with any of these things. We're going to include it as supplemental guidance. Okay, I could go through a lot of these. I wrote down a lot of notes, although I did not read all the subcategories. But I guess one other thing I really wanted to point out here as I kind of come to a close on this is that it was not technically specific. For example, if you looked at protection AC-3, which is for remote management, I was looking for them to say for enhanced and extended that you needed two-factor remote authentication, but they didn't include that. They talked about authentication appropriate for the impact level, which gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of what you put in there. Now, I understand why they did that. It's always dangerous when you get prescriptive with technology, but I think in some areas this is actually going to hurt them. For example, I can't imagine the US government with the new pipeline regulations not saying two-factor authentication is required for remote access. I mean, if we have senators, as I've said on the show a few times, if we have senators actually saying those words, you would expect that to come out in the regulations. The other thing that really came through in the protect area was there was a lot of, quote, where technically supported. So you could opt out or say we are not meeting this requirement because it is not technically supported. This was a big issue with NERC SIP in the early days, and it still may be. I'm not as involved in NERC SIP as I was in the early days, but a lot of people got out of a lot of the requirements just by saying, oh, it's not technically supported, so we're fine. It'll be interesting to see how that works out. The last comment I might have on the actual protection profiles is that, like everything I've seen in CSF, I think that response and recovery get short shrift. You see so many things on identify and protect, some on detection. That's a little bit underplayed, but response and recovery are so important, and the requirements are so minimal that I really worry that we're not being prepared for when we're actually compromised. Now, maybe some of those small requirements could require a lot of action behind them. But I've also seen asset owners meet those small requirements with small paragraphs and really not have a strong response and recovery capability. So I would just say that that would be something where if I was implementing a plan or a program, I would probably emphasize that more than 1164 does. But again, 1164 was following the cybersecurity framework, so I can't fault them too much because they took the right approach. And I think this is a cybersecurity framework issue more than it is a API 1164 issue. So at the end here, is it worth your $200? Well, again, it is a big improvement over version 2, and I would say, yes, if you are in the pipeline security industry, it is worth your $200 to go out and buy this. If you're an asset owner in the pipeline industry, owner operator pipelines, if you service them, if you do security projects for them, it is worth buying. I wish you could get it for free, but I think it's worth buying because you'll be able to leverage it in your in your talks with management. It is an authoritative document in your field. So I think it's worth it. As always, I really like to get questions and comments from you, not only on this episode, but also on, letting me know about other topics, other episodes, other guests you would like to see on the show. The easiest way, you can always email me at s4@digitalbond.com, or you see if you're watching the video, my Twitter is @digitalbond. That's another way to reach me, or you can reach me on LinkedIn. I'm on both of those quite a bit. But if you want your question to be read on the show, go to dale-peterson.com, and on the right-hand side, you'll see a record your question button. You just can click on that button, record your question. We'll play your question and answer it on the show. I love to get your questions, so please send them in. So that's all for this episode, and I'll talk to you next time. Something warrants an unsolicited response.